Hey guys, got something sort of different, but not really. And I've got to tell you, I'm just really excited to work on this today.
I think what I'll do is recommend that we sell this or burn it as soon as I can get it out of the garage. But maybe I shouldn't say that out loud, because then that's like premeditated.
This is my wife's Excursion. It's got the 2005 6-liter in it, and it's got a problem with the EGR cooler. And the way I know that is we were driving it around, and I got out, and while it was still running, and you could smell like a sweet smell from the exhaust, so that's a sign that coolant was starting to leak somewhere within the engine. I also pulled the EGR, and it was really clean. So when these things start to have a coolant leak, it almost sort of steam cleans the EGR valve, which is good and bad. At least we don't have to worry about cleaning that in the meantime. But I did some initial troubleshooting. It looks like it's the EGR cooler. I'm hoping it's not the head gaskets. So I'm going to try throwing the EGR cooler at it. Once I take it apart, I'll be able to see if it's got issues or not. This is the square style design because it is the later model 0405 Powerstroke. This one should have the 03 version, but the engine was replaced at some point before we bought it, so it's got the late model 04 version, so that will make things a little bit easier. And this kind of goes the same as like those HPOP videos you've seen on the channel and things of that nature. You got to take a lot of stuff off the top of the engine to get to it. So we're going to take the alternator off, we're going to take the turbo off, and a bunch of other stuff that's on top of the engine so that we can get easy access to that EGR cooler. So I went to the guys out at Pro Source Diesel, and they have an EGR cooler. I think it was like $139 or something. Comes with all the gaskets you need, the cooler, and everything you need to take it apart and put it back together. So, like I said, we're going to throw that in here and see how it goes. So, let's get going. So let's start with something simple first, which is removing the air filter and air box assemblies. I'll get you guys in here closer so you can see what I'm doing. Some people find this complicated. I don't really. It's really just sort of the way the design is. So the way the filter sits in here in the center, it's a canister style filter. It's got this piece on the front that has a duct that runs to the grill and one that runs over to the side so it can pull air from either direction, and then it hooks into the turbo back here. It's got these clamps to hold it together, and the troublesome part about this is the filter itself is got this hard plastic housing on it. It's got two tabs at the bottom that hold this front piece and the run to the turbo, so you have to sort of wiggle things back and forth to get it out. It can help if you remove the battery, but you don't have to. It really is just one of those finesse things. So you've got to get this piece off, disconnected. You got to pull it up to pull those tabs out of the slot, and then you got to move it towards the rear of the truck so that it clears and gets out of the way, and the air filter can come up. The same kind of goes for this front piece. Now, this isn't connected to anything other than the air filter, so you can pull it up out of the way, or you can try to pull it out with the air filter element itself. It's really up to you, whatever works, whatever's easier. A lot of times they'll come out together like this anyways. And you got to keep pushing that other piece back to get it out of the way, and then that's it. So like I said, it's got this tab on the front that grabs the bottom piece of the front, slides in here, and then holds on with those clamps, and then the same thing back here. And then it's got these two tabs on the bottom that sit down into the bracket that the battery tray also uses to give it some support. And then there's a giant mouse nest in here. That's lovely. That's gotta add at least 50 horsepower. Our truck sits for long periods of time, given everything that's kind of going on with COVID and all that, so not surprised that there's an apartment complex of mice in here. So we'll clean that up as we go along too. So we'll keep moving forward, pulling all the rest of this stuff off. I just thought, you know, since a few people have asked me about that in the past, I'd show you guys real quick how to do that. So we'll keep. So
I've already loosened this clamp up. This is the clamp that comes off the turbo and runs down to the exhaust, if you guys aren't sure. So it's a band clamp, right? There's a lip on the turbo side and a lip on the flange that's welded to that exhaust pipe, the down tube, that it grabs both sides of that and holds it together. It's like a pinch hold. It doesn't have a whole lot of like horizontal force, but it will keep it together. And there's a lip hook thing on the top here that holds it up. So if you just go He-Man and like start taking a crowbar to that thing and trying to peel it off there from the hundreds of thousands of miles of heat cycles it's been through, you're just going to tear it up and you're going to have to buy a new clamp. And they're not all that expensive, but you know, you don't want to go buy a $30 clamp just because, you know, you're like me and an idiot. So take some WD-40 and you want to soak the clamp down kind of like this. Get either side of it. Use that to help break things loose. And then take a crowbar, pry bar, something that you can get the reach back in there. And if you just tap it a couple times, you can break it loose. See that one? I should mention it's a 3-piece. So that broke the back one. There's the front, and then we'll see now. And then you can knock your light down at the same time, just like me. So now that it'll spin freely, when we take the T-bolt out of the clamp, we can just take it off there. We don't have to fight it. We're not going to deform it and damage it. You can buy them on Amazon, you know, because I've done this before, and they're not too expensive. But like I said, you don't want to have to buy one. These trucks are expensive enough. You don't want to have to buy one if you don't have to. So here's what the clamp looks like. Like I said, it's got this channel that fits either side and grabs this side of the flange back here. See how it's got a flange on either side with this seam in the middle, and then there's that hook on the top that holds it in place, and that makes it easier to put it back together. So when you go to do this and put it back together, you can just hang that clamp up there and it won't fall down. You don't have to worry about jockeying and holding that in place and then getting the band clamp. That's it. The other beautiful thing is, I'm not sure that when they were putting this truck together, designing and everything, as great as engineers are, I don't think they meant for the turbo to come out while the engine and cab and everything were assembled. Because when you take the body off these things, it's amazing and easy to work on. But if you're trying to do it like me in a pinch, I don't feel like taking the body off the truck just to do this. It's not all that difficult, really. They made it so that you can do it, but you know, with it being an excursion, there's a bunch of bolts that have to come out. Most of them are probably rusted. It's got AC lines that run to the rear, and then you'd have to drain the coolant and disconnect, you know, some harnesses and things like that, and you can lift the cab off. All in all, it's not too bad, but it's probably half a day's worth of work for me. Like I said, and I don't want to do that. So we're gonna finagle and fish and cuss to get this turbo out of here with the engine on, because while you could do all this probably with the turbo in, it's just going to be way easier to get at everything and see what we're doing if we pull that turbo out. So the key to this turbo removal is you obviously have to disconnect that band clamp that we just took off for the exhaust down tube. There's the intake tube that runs over to the air filter that we took off already. There's 3 bolts around the base, or around the turbo, that hold it to the bracket and keep it in place. There's that connector that you see right there with the yellow and black leads, and then there's the oil feed tube, which is sort of hidden. It snakes under there. And that's it to pull the turbo off. There's 2 bolts on the top that take that off. So that's not the hard part. The hard part is you have to get it off the pedestal and off the tube, the oil drain tube at the bottom of the turbo, and then you sort of got to twist it and turn it and tug it to get it to change the orientation. So you almost think of it as you have to rotate it this way and up as it comes out. So by the time I pull it out of here, this intake tube is going to be facing towards the back, and the whole turbo will be clocked 90 degrees this way to sort of squeeze it out. I'll show you as I'm doing it if I can. I'm not sure I can get the camera up here at the same time, but it's not it's not impossible. It's just not the easiest or most fun thing to do. So a thing that'll help you is take these Christmas tree clips off so that you can remove this plastic channel guard, and then I always take a bungee cord and hook it through one of those holes, go up to the latch for the hood release, and that'll hold it out of the way and give you a little bit more extra room. I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. So I just take one of these. That's a pry bar for taking apart interiors. It's got this nice little crowbar end thing on it, and you can fish that under these clips like this. You know, take your time because you don't want to break it, and then you can just kind of wiggle it out, hopefully without mangling it, and it'll come out. Because the plastic on this guard gets so brittle over time that this thing just wants to sort of destroy itself as you take it off. So you got to be real careful. Now that you've got some slack, like I said, you can take a bungee cord, hook it right here, and you can pull this up out of the way. It works better if you put it around the bottom, kind of like that, and sort of work it up out of your way. So you have to remove this oil line from the top. Obviously there's this sensor you have to deconnect from up here. You have to remove the band clamp from the exhaust, and then there's another one that runs down to the actual EGR cooler pipes and everything. It's around the backside here. You have to remove that. There's a bolt down here at the bottom. There's one on the that's it runs in like this. There's another one on this other side back down here that runs in like that, and then on the back side, if you go over top of the exhaust pipe, there's one that goes down into the turbo pedestal that sits on top of the block. You got to remove that one too. And once you have all that loose, the only thing really holding it in here is the weight of itself. It's got these dowels that help it align properly with the turbo pedestal, and then there's a oil drain tube on the bottom that you have to monkey with. So the way to make it come up or out is you have to pull it up off that drain tube and separate it from the other two exhaust sides, and then sort of try to wiggle it around to get it out of the way. The best thing to do is to try to get all this stuff out of your way so you don't have to fight with it, because the turbo is awkward enough to get everything out of here. And we'll go ahead and take this coolant line off as well, so we can have some. So my degas bottle is empty because it's got a coolant leak, obviously. So if you're doing this and you're not fighting a coolant problem, there will more than likely be fluid in there when you remove that line. And then I take the alternator off just because it gives me access to move this thing. You could probably do it without. I have not tried, just because it's hard enough to do this. I'd rather move things out of my way if at all possible. Alright, so now we're ready to try to wrestle this thing out of here. once you have it out of there, you can set it on the bracket for the alternator and get yourself better position to get it out of here. So this is what it looks like removed. You can see we have a nice mouse nest under the turbo here. So these are the turbo pedestal mounting points I was talking about. So here's the one on the back, one on the front, and the one that goes down into the pedestal there. And then this is the down tubes that run into the or come off the header into the back of the turbo, excuse me. And then this is obviously the exhaust. This is our EGR cooler right down here. This is what is leaking and we need to replace. This horseshoe that you see here is the intake manifold. So there's a ton of bolts and harnesses we're going to have to move out of the way. If you were pulling the H-pop, you'd have to pull this, you'd have to keep going, pull this turbo pedestal out, and then there's a plate under here that covers the H-pop. You can see the back part of it here where the IPR valve is. So to do this and make some room to get the intake manifold out, I'm going to disconnect all these harnesses. Most of them are for the injectors, and move those out of the way. I'm not sure, but I think I might have to remove the oil filter housing and the fuel filter housing. I was hoping I wouldn't have to, but I think I might have to on this one. But as you can see, it's buried down on the top of the motor here, real nice. And then this is the turbo side. So the turbo is sitting in the truck kind of like this. Here's the one bolt and the dowel pin that lines up. Here's the one on the back side where you have to go over the exhaust pipe. And then the one easiest front passenger side to get to. Alright guys, I thought I'd give you an update, show you where we're at. So we've got just about everything removed. Now it's time to take a bunch of the stuff off so we can get the intake manifold out. Two things I wanted to show you is one, you see this is the throttle assembly. This particular truck has an actual throttle blade in there. Some of the other ones don't. This throttle blade is in there to help improve the EGR flow and performance. And as you can see down in there in the intake manifold, it's wet. So we definitely got an EGR cooler leak. I think somebody might have been in here to replace it before. There's a lot of bolts and stuff missing as you get down here. Some of them are laying in the bottom of the motor, or in the bottom of the engine valley. So that's, you know, not too bad. We'll go ahead and put those back where they belong. Another thing to note is you'll see along here some of these intake bolts right here have studs. Mark those with a paint pen or a marker or something so you put them back in the right spot. It doesn't matter everywhere, but there's a heat shield that's supposed to be here that was missing. Back here is a ground for the FICM. So this one's actually loose. That's not good. So you want to make sure those go back in the right spot. There's a line right here for the map sensor. You want to remove that. There's also a bolt over here that holds this heater tube or coolant tube on. That needs to be removed. Down here below, there's some bolts that you can see are missing on this truck that attach the fan blade assembly and that housing to the intake manifold. Those need to come off. There's another one over here, and then there's a stud right there. So here's the bolt down here. There's a stud right here. So I'm going to take this whole throttle assembly off. And then the other thing that kind of sucks, show you right here, is the fuel filter housing, this right here, and the oil filter housing. Those have to come off as well to get this thing out of here. It's a big U shape, so it goes underneath those, so keep that in mind. And then for the rest of it, you just got to make sure the harnesses and everything are out of the way so you can pull it out. The EGR cooler is attached to the underside, so there's no way to get it out without taking the intake manifold out. You can also see I cleaned up the valley down there. It was full of gunk and mice nests and all kinds of other stuff, so I cleaned that up while I'm in here. One, it'll help me catch leaks, and two, it'll make sure I don't drop anything down in the intake manifold when I'm cleaning this stuff up. So you can see the gaskets on the intake manifold here. I have replacements for those. There's a ton of gaskets, O-rings, and hoses that need to be replaced. So when you go to do this, make sure you buy a kit that includes all that stuff, or you're going to have to find it. So like these O-rings on the turbo drain tube have to get replaced. This line needs to get replaced. There's O-rings that attach it here, And then there's the intake valve gaskets themselves. Excuse me, there's the intake manifold gaskets themselves. So just make sure you replace all that stuff while you're in here. There's no point in trying to reuse a gasket and making you have to do this twice. So we'll keep plugging away at this, and I'll show you guys what we got when we get this thing out of here. One more thing I wanted to show you guys before I forget is this is how the tube into the throttle body assembly sits. There's 4 bolts that hold it on, obviously. Three of them are just regular shorts, and then this one on the front passenger side is the long one. So when you're putting this back together, if you forget which one goes where, that's where that goes. Alright guys, we've been working at it. As you can see, I've got the housing for the throttle body and assembly and all that taken off, and this is where the fuel filter and the oil filter were. You take these 4 bolts off down here around the canister. It separates into 2 pieces, and the oil filter housing and the fuel filter housing come off. So now we can go around and take these bolts off and pull the intake manifold. I've marked it already to show where the studs are, so I don't have to think about it. I can just put it back the way it was. Just got to separate a few more things from the EGR cooler, and we'll be ready to go. As you can see, there's a ton of stuff that goes into this to take it apart. I guess because whoever designed this engine hates mechanics, and you can sort of see why mechanics hate engineers, because they do stuff like this. I guess because I'm both a mechanic and an engineer, it must be why I have RBF all the time. I guess I hate myself because I would do something like this to myself. So we're learning things here today. That's always good. So next I'm going to take all these bolts off, and then we'll yank this intake manifold out of here, and I'll show you guys what it looks like on the bottom side. So as you can see, we got the intake manifold out of here. Couple of things to keep in mind. There's about 14,673 bolts on the intake manifold, so those take a little while to come out. Just make sure you keep track of them. Like I said, mark the ones with studs before you take them out, so you know. And then there's 2 that are a little bit shorter with studs, so make sure you know where those go. They go in the front, so don't try putting those towards the back. So keep in mind there's a bunch of coolant in there, so when you take the intake manifold out, you want something under there to catch it. And we'll clean up all this coolant that's on the top. And then it's easier if you disconnect most of these harnesses and connectors to keep from breaking them. I had one that was broken, so I'm going to have to repair that. And then down here is a O-ring that goes into this top neck above the water pump. Make sure you have that in there when you replace it. I've seen a few guys forget to put that in there, and then it's pouring coolant all over the place. You got to redo everything. So make sure you take note of where your gaskets and seals are so that you replace them before you put everything back together. So we'll clean all this up, and then I'll show you guys what we're going to do next. So this is the intake manifold, upside down obviously, and here's the EGR cooler. So it attaches to the bottom here. Oh, nice. So there's one bolt here, as you can see, on the top. And once you take that out, you can remove this, and there's an insert here, and then it attaches up front. This hose, make sure you buy one of those when you get your replacement cooler. It's kind of difficult to take off because of the way they put it on here. It's like a slip attachment. So I damaged mine when I took it off, but that's okay because I have one to replace it anyways. And then you want to clean up all these mating surfaces on the bottom here, especially here. That's where that O-ring was that I was telling you about, where it drips lets the coolant run back into the block. So make sure you clean all these surfaces up so you have a good seal before you put it back together. Alright guys, so I thought I'd show you what comes in the kit from ProSource Diesel. So this is their Spool Logic EGR cooler. Comes with new hoses, like I said, the metal gaskets. This is a gasket for the top of the turbo for that oil cooler line. It also comes with the intake gaskets and all these little metal plugs and pieces. This slides in here and is the threads to secure the oil cooler. They even come with a replacement nut. This one has an Allen head on it. The other one is just, you know, regular hex head bolt. And then it's got all the O-rings you need. These yellow ones are for the oil drain pipe on the bottom of the turbo.
and everything else you need. This is that donut gasket that goes on the bottom of the intake manifold to drain the fluid back into the block. So make sure you replace that before you put this all back together. But that's it. So we'll get this prepped and stick it all back in the truck. Just make sure you know where things go, and take a look at things. I take pictures when I'm taking stuff apart, especially if I'm, worried I might not put it back together that day, just so I don't forget. So take a lot of pictures so you know how to put all this stuff together, and then you won't have any issues. But in case you forget something, I'll show you. So this is a metal washer gasket, whatever you want to call it, that goes on the back side of the EGR cooler here. There's this black O-ring right here. This goes on that surface here. Obviously it goes over the slip and sits in this cavity. Right here you get a metal washer gasket. Like I said, these two go on the oil drain tube back into the block. This one, like I said, is the oil for the gasket, excuse me, for the turbo. They also send new bolts for the turbo. So these are the bolts that hold the turbo in place. This is for the clip that goes on the side of the turbo to hold the wiring harness in place.
I meant to show this to you guys before. When I said the two shorter bolts on the intake manifold go towards the front, they hold the EGR cooler in from the top. So if you look over here on the one I took out, it's got these two threaded holes. Those reach through and grab the EGR cooler from the top. You should see there. So just thought I'd put that in there to help you guys out. And then, like I said, make sure you clean up these mating surfaces so your gaskets seal real nice. And then when you guys are sticking all this stuff together, don't forget to take this donut O-ring and put it right here. And don't let it fall out, because that'll be a bad day. It'll leak coolant real bad around here, I would assume. And then I cleaned up all these mating surfaces in here, so I'll go ahead and throw just a little bit of gasket maker on these to help the intake manifold gasket stick when I'm throwing everything in here. Alright guys, so we got the intake manifold back in. Patience is key here. So what I did, what works for me anyways, is I put just a thin layer of gasket maker on the intake manifold mating surface just to keep the intake manifold from sliding around. I slide the intake manifold gaskets on, and then comes the strange kabuki dance of getting the intake manifold in. So it's a U shape, obviously, and it's nice and long and got all these protrusions and hard surfaces on it. So I lift up on this harness and sort of tuck the back end under and try to get it, starting to sort of lay flat, and then sort of wiggle it back and forth into place. And then I line up this gasket back here, and I put just a tiny little bit of RTV on it just to keep the metal gasket from falling off. And then the whole time you're like moving the intake manifold a little bit and then sliding the gaskets back into place, moving the intake manifold, sliding the gaskets, back and forth, back and forth. If you take this harness off completely, it would be way easier, but I'm too dumb to do that, so I didn't. And then once I had it, roughly where it goes, I lined up the intake manifold with the gasket and the bosses on the heads, right? So if you look right here, you can see you make a straight line down. Here's the bolt, the through hole through the intake manifold, the hole that's in the gasket, and then the boss that's on the head itself. So I tried to get these as close as I could by eye, and then I just started putting the bolts in and finger tightening them. Whatever. I just started putting the bolts in not even finger tight, just enough to hold it in place. And once you get one or two of these on the side, you can do the whole thing. So I focused on getting the driver's side lined up, and then because it's blind over here, on the passenger side, I thought it would be easier to line up on the driver's side, and to me, it just works better that way. Just wanted to show you getting everything back together, and a couple of things to note when you're putting this back together. The intake doesn't take a lot of torque to hold down, so don't over tighten the bolts. If you're a fan of tightening things down until they snap, don't do that, because the last thing you want to do is try to extract one of these bolts out of the head after you got everything back together. And then like I said, mark the holes that have the studs before you take everything apart. That way you know where they go, and you can mark all the holes with the studs before you take everything apart, just so you know where they go back, and you can clip these wire harnesses. You don't want to put a stud where it doesn't belong, like under the alternator. There's not enough room. So if you were to put one of these studded bolts there, that'd be a problem for you. And then make sure you reattach the ground wire back there in the back for the fickum. It goes all the way to the back. I think that's it. The other thing is, it's a real pain in the butt to do that blue rubber line that connects the EGR to the coolant outlet there, inlet, whatever that is. So what you have to do is mount the EGR cooler to the bottom of the intake. Then when you go to put it back in, leave it loose at the back on that bolt back there, and make sure you install that rubber line onto the EGR before you put it up here. I used a bunch of O-ring grease and lubricated it real well so I could slide it further back and move it. So you push it back a little bit farther on the EGR than it belongs. That gives you the clearance to put everything in here, because you're not going to be able to get the hose on there once the EGR and everything's in place. It's just too stiff, and it's got metal inners to reinforce it. The other hard part about this is getting the EGR to line up there in the back so that you keep the gasket on and you can get that metal band clamp back on it. So you might have to leave the EGR loose and massage things around. I had to keep playing with everything to get the intake just exactly where it would be or wanted to be, and to get the EGR lined up back there as well. But that's it. We'll keep plugging away at this, and we'll get it fired up, see if it works. Alright guys, I had to fight with this turbo way 1,000 times more than I've ever had to fight with one before. I've never done this on an excursion though, so that could be the problem, because I know they've got some extra stuff in here. So what I ended up doing to get this to work was I took my jack and some pipe and I lifted the exhaust pipe up to try to get out of my way. You can't go all the way up with it, because then it'll bind in a different spot. You need it to where it's sort of positioned like this, and it's about an inch or so away from the max lift on it. From there, you gotta wiggle the turbo in, kind of like you got it out. You start backside down, get it under the firewall here, and you can kind of pivot it up. The key is you got to line it up with like 1,000 different things in here. So the first thing you have to watch is these dowels. There's one on this side, one on the opposite side. They got to match those grooves just like they did when you took it off. Then you got to stick the drain tube into that plate over top of the H-pop, and then get it lined up with the turbo up here. And you just you need to position it to where you're mostly going this way, right? And if you can get it close to being lined up with this tab, you're most of the way there. Once you do that, you can stick a crowbar under between the turbo pedestal. Here, let me get the light around here so you guys can see what I'm doing. So you get a crowbar in here between this turbo pedestal and the bottom of the turbo. And I'll show you with my crowbar here. And you're not going to reef on it. You're just going to stick this under here so that you get an easier way to lift in the back. And you just kind of keep wiggling it and lifting it in the back so that you can get it lined up. So you can get it lined up with the tab over here on this side. That tab right down there. And then you got to get it somewhat close to the inlet where it comes off the exhaust manifolds into the back of the turbo. You can move that around with ratchet straps or a pry bar or something else to get it perfectly lined up. You just need it sort of close. Now once you've got it sitting on here, make sure you go back down and properly seat. Make sure you go back down and properly seat that oil drain tube. See how mine's sticking out a little bit? You can see that lip. There's a couple different styles of that tube. This one is like the worst kind I've ever seen. It's got the biggest tabs on it to hold the turbo, to hold it on the turbo pedestal. Most of them are way smaller, and it allows you more freedom of movement. This one, they're like huge, and you get no play, so you have to get it almost 100% perfect, which you can't because the firewall is in the way. Because why would you make an engine where you could work on it when the body's on the truck? That would just make too much sense, right? So I think what I'll do is recommend that we sell this or burn it as soon as I can get it out of the garage. But maybe I shouldn't say that out loud because then that's like premeditated. So we'll take care of that in editing. But now I just got to hook up the rest of the lines on here, get the bolts in, get the band clamps on for the exhaust and for the inlet, put the rest of the tubes on for the intercooler, put the batteries back in, and the rest of the rubber lines back on for the map sensor and the EGR and all that stuff. So I'm not sure if this is one of those things I should admit to anybody that I do or not, but it's almost impossible sometimes to get this to line up back here where the inlet pipes come in. See how it's sitting down on that? You want those lips to be touching. If you try to do it with the band clamp to get them to draw together, you're just going to destroy the band clamp. It's not designed to do that. It's really just to hold those two mating surfaces together. The pipe that come, those up tubes that come from the manifolds, it has that lip on the inside, so you got to get that to line up and then insert into the turbo. So one of the ways you can do that, if you're lucky, sometimes you can just tap it with a hammer and slide it over and it'll seat. Other times, like in this case, it's got to come up forward and go towards the passenger side. So what I end up doing is taking a ratchet strap, as you can see, and there's a just enough of a lip here that you can get it to interfere and connect, and then I gently sort of pull it in the direction that I need based on a hook that's in the firewall somewhere. You don't put a whole bunch of tension on it. You do that, you're just going to tear some stuff up. You're really just trying to encourage it to go the way that you want it to go. So the way that I have it set up here, it gently lifts it up and it pulls it towards the passenger side where I need it, and then once I have it under tension a little bit, I can tap it with a pry bar and a hammer, and it will slide back in there and drop right in where it's supposed to go. So there's probably a better way to do it. It's just the way that I've been doing it because it's the way that I found that works. But like I said, don't go putting a bunch of tension on it. You're just trying to gently tug it and encourage it to go where you want it to go.